One of the more common patterns that begins to appear when working with people over time has very little to do with intelligence, competence, or capability. It has to do with authority, and that particular factor is often missed. A surprising number of adults who are otherwise articulate, capable, and confident, much like yourselves, in most areas of their lives begin to behave very differently the moment they find themselves in the presence of anyone they perceive as holding power over them. The shift can be subtle at first, almost invisible from the outside, but once you begin noticing it, that pattern, it becomes unmistakable. These individuals manage complex responsibilities throughout their lives. They make thoughtful decisions, they communicate clearly with colleagues, and often handle demanding professional environments with competence and clear composure. Many of them are respected by their peers. Some even lend to their teams or provide assistance. Yet something changes the moment a certain form of hierarchy enters the room. Now imagine the room being any situation. Sometimes that hierarchy takes the form of a senior executive or a dominating manager. Sometimes it appears as a powerful client whose approval seems to carry disproportionate weight in your life. In other cases, it is not even a single person but a group, a room full of people whose collective authority seems intimidating. And when that shift occurs, the person who only moments earlier appeared to be confident suddenly starts to shrink. You become smaller and smaller as time progresses. Individuals who normally speak clearly start choosing their words carefully, sometimes excessively so. Their tones tend to soften, their pace slows down, they hesitate before expressing disagreement. In meetings, they may find themselves agreeing to things they privately know are unreasonable, impractical, or even completely unfair. What makes the situation interesting is that these reactions often happen almost instantaneously, in what we could probably assume to be nanoseconds. Now visualize yourself as that person. A person can walk into that meeting feeling completely prepared, all the notes in hand, confident in their thinking, and ready to speak their mind. Yet within moments of entering that authority figure, something changes internally. The moment you encounter them, your thoughts process differently. Their command over language begins to slip, their confidence wavers. Thoughts that once felt clear suddenly seem distant or inaccessible. It's like you draw a blank. When discussing these experiences later, many individuals describe something quite specific. They say they could actually feel themselves becoming smaller in the same room. Their sense of value feels diminished. Their thoughts slow down almost to a point of nothingness. Their ability to respond confidently has disappeared. Some even describe a strange kind of mental blankness, as if the arguments they would normally make simply vanished from their minds. The moment they needed them, they were not there. One client once described the sensation in a way that stayed with me. He said it felt almost like standing naked in a room where everyone else was fully clothed. That vulnerability was not physical, of course, but psychological. A sudden exposure, a sense that one's defenses had disappeared at precisely the moment they were needed. Working with such individuals who describe these experiences, you begin to understand that there's a certain pattern that begins to emerge. It repeats over and over again. They talk about walking into meetings already feeling tense. And I'm sure if you address that in your mind, you can feel it too. Sometimes that tension begins building even earlier, the moment the meeting notification appears on their calendar, or a pop of a message that it's 15 minutes to the meeting left. Before that moment, they may be perfectly composed, even confident, brimming with that. Yet once the meeting approaches, their mind begins rehearsing possible scenarios. That is called the failure complex. They imagine what they will say. They practice how they will present their point. They think through the arguments they want to make. And this is moments before they're able to walk into the room. And then they're in the situation and the meeting begins. Within moments, those carefully rehearsed thoughts vanish. Sometimes they leave meetings feeling frustrated with themselves, replaying the interaction over and over again in their minds. Later in the day, or sometimes later that same evening, they suddenly remember all the things they should have said but didn't. What becomes interesting is that outside of these moments, the same individuals demonstrate strong judgment and competence. They manage responsibilities effectively. So do all of us in our daily workaday lives. They communicate clearly with colleagues at similar levels of authority. They solve complex problems, address multiple scenarios, and they think strategically. In other words, their intelligence had never disappeared. Their capability has not diminished at all. The shift occurs specifically in the presence of a certain kind of power. At first glance, this behavior can look like simple workplace anxiety and is often mistaken as such, or even a lack of confidence for that matter. Friends and colleagues may even dismiss it casually, saying, "It's just a meeting, there's nothing to worry about, just speak your mind." But when explored more carefully, the same situation is really that simple. What tends to emerge underneath these experiences is often a much older psychological problem or a pattern you have not recognized. One that has very little to do with the present workplace and far more to do with how human beings learn to respond to authority in their early life. Many adults unknowingly carry forward internal responses that were originally shaped in childhood environments where authority figures held significant emotional power. Parents, teachers, coaches, caregivers, you name it. These individuals often become the earliest templates through which the mind learns how to interpret hierarchy. In environments where disagreements led to punishment, humiliation, or the withdrawal of approval, the early developing mind begins to form a simple but powerful association. Authority becomes linked with risk. The lesson may never be spoken directly, but it is absorbed nonetheless. Be careful, do not challenge, stay agreeable, avoid confrontation. You've heard all these things. They've been with you ever since you were born, or pretty much into your adolescence, all through your life. Over time, these lessons become deeply internalized. What originally began as a learned survival strategy slowly transforms into an automatic psychological response mechanism. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because what is happening in these moments is not simply emotional, it is neurological. When a person perceives authority as threatening, the brain threat detection system activates almost instantly. The amygdala, the small almond shaped structure deep within the brain responsible for detecting danger, begins scanning the environment for signals, a potential form of harm that awaits you. If the brain interprets the authority figure as threatening, the nervous system begins preparing the body for a defensive response. Almost natural, isn't it? In environments where confrontation was historically met with punishment or humiliation, the brain learns that the safest strategy is submission. The nervous system begins choosing safety long before the conscious mind has the chance to argue otherwise. The body reacts before the intellect has time to intervene. From the outside, though, this reaction can look like hesitation or some form of uncertainty, and your face tends to change and your body reacts differently. From the inside, though, it feels like survival. These reactions are the nervous system preparing for a perceived threat, a risk profile that has often been mapped onto the mind long before this workplace ever entered the picture. For many people, pretty much all of us, this mapping begins in childhood, which means that learning to regulate the body becomes just as important as learning to regulate your thoughts. Sometimes the intervention used in counseling sessions are surprisingly simple. Good counselors understand this very well. Human beings often forget that the body itself plays a central role in your emotional regulation. And I'll tell you how. A person may practice slowing their breathing deliberately before entering a meeting. Not dramatically, not visibly, very gently, through a signal to the nervous system that this environment is going to be safe. Sometimes people simply need to pause and breathe. In other cases, individuals use small grounding techniques. Give it a try. Subtle physical cues that bring attention back to the body and interrupt the escalation of anxiety before it fully develops. Even something as simple as lightly pressing two fingers together or placing both feet firmly on the floor can help anchor attention in the present moment. It brings you back to your center. The focus returns to the body instead of the anxiety that might otherwise fill the room. These actions may appear trivial on the surface, and I'm sure that's what you feel, but neurologically, they perform an important function. They interrupt the automatic escalation of the threat response that's occurring in your mind. And when the body begins stabilizing, the mind regains access to its full range of thinking again. There's another strategy that often proves surprisingly effective. Instead of focusing their attention directly on any authority figure in that room, individuals are encouraged to shift their attention towards someone else present in that same meeting or in that conversation. Perhaps a colleague they trust or someone whose presence feels neutral or balanced in some way. Psychologically, what this does is it creates a subtle but important shift inside your mind. Instead of confronting the authority present, the person begins experiencing themselves as speaking to a peer. What naturally occurs then is that the conversation becomes less about defending oneself and more about contributing to the conversation present in that room, which is what the meeting was meant to be in the first place. The authority figure is still present, though, of course. The hierarchy still exists, but the perceived threat diminishes enough for the person's voice to start emerging again naturally. Over time, these small adjustments begin creating new experiences in situations that previously triggered intimidation. The brain begins updating its expectations. It's almost like a reboot. What once ended in humiliation is now a change shift altogether. Speaking up does not produce the catastrophe that the nervous system once anticipated. Gradually, that internal alarm begins quieting down. But one final element, this is what completes the process. During deeper counseling work, individuals are sometimes guided back towards earlier experiences that originally shaped their response to authority. This is rarely done abruptly. It emerges gradually through conversation, which is the foundation of any form of good counseling. A client may begin describing a difficult manager and suddenly notice that the emotional tone of the story feels strangely familiar. Can you sense it too? The way the authority figure speaks reminds them of someone else from their past. Perhaps a teacher or a coach who ridiculed any former mistakes they made, or a parent whose approval was unpredictable. As these memories tend to surface, people often realize something important. For years, they were carrying conversations that were never finished, words that were never spoken, reactions that were never allowed. In those moments, the counseling process becomes less about workplace behavior and more about releasing something that has been waiting for expression. And here's the catch: most people already know the truth about what they want to say. They have often known it for years, far longer than they can remember. The difficulty is rarely discovering the truth, rather, the challenge is allowing themselves to speak it out. In many sessions, the most meaningful moments arrives when a client finally says it out loud, something that they had previously only carried internally. Not necessarily to the authority figures present in their life, but within that safe space of the conversation itself. And once that truth is spoken, something begins shifting altogether. The internal authority that once silenced them slowly starts losing its grip. From that point forward, the work becomes less about forcing courage and more about practicing a different posture towards the world they face. The individual learns the authority can be acknowledged without surrendering their voice to it. Disagreement can exist without the world imploding or exploding around them. And the room itself, whether a meeting room, a boardroom, a conversation, your own lounge with a senior executive, with your spouse or somebody you know, becomes what it was always meant to be: a place where a conversation happens, an idea is exchanged between people who each carry their own experience and judgment. Mind you, the hierarchy will always exist, and it continues to do so. It will prevail in your lifetime. What changes is the nervous system's reading of that threat. For someone who has spent years associating authority with danger, that update really happens all at once. It happens slowly and steadily, not in a single moment of courage, not in a single counseling session, mind you. It begins more quietly than that. Often it begins the first time someone says something difficult in the presence of a figure they always feared. And even then, nothing catastrophic happens. So, what do they see before them is no humiliation, no punishment, no collapse of the world they would imagine would follow. The next time the person walks into the same room, the alarm is still there, but it's slightly quieter. Because now The nervous system maps a path that the echoes of your voice, inside and out, may not necessarily create an avenue for, which leads towards any form of danger.